We've heard quite a lot from previous speakers about data, and I'm just going to talk about how it is useful for everything that we've talked about in the risk-based approach. So my name's Christina Liassides, and I'm working for Gaist as an asset management consultant. But prior to that, I worked for over 10 years as head of highway maintenance and network management in Brighton and Hove City Council, a unitary. So, understanding risk, well, we've talked quite a lot about this already this morning, but I've taken a quote from the infrastructure asset management guidance because, as we've said previously, it's not necessarily a new concept, and it's actually identified very clearly that implementation of the asset management framework requires a comprehensive understanding and assessment of the risks and consequences involved. And it goes on to say that understanding of risk enables that asset management process to address the issues identified. So it's actually a very important plank of the whole asset management framework. And assessing risk, well, risk is simple. You know, we've all seen this particular risk assessment matrix, and clearly you know if something's around here, you need to do something about it. More about if something is here. So it's very unlikely to happen, but if it does, it can be hugely costly to individuals and to the local authority. So there's all that, and as we know, very few organisations have sufficient resources to operate around this level. So already, actually, there's a lot of balancing to be done when you're looking at your risk assessments. And you know, we've heard a lot about potholes today for obvious reasons, and clearly there's a pothole that needs mending. This photo's not so good, but I think for those of you who have seen this many a time on your highway, you can see there's actually some major crazing and subsidence there. And you would say immediately that's a safety risk to the user. But on the other hand, if this carries 1,400 buses a day and people cross over at that point, and that's in the corner of a small cul-de-sac that serves 6 houses, what does that say about the risk apportionment? And in the following slide, again, you can see there's an asset risk and a user risk. And the two could be quite different. I mean, there's clearly different levels of paving slabs, vehicle overrun happening there. But actually, there's also subsidence happening on that pavement. And in fact, in poor light, it might be difficult for users to realise that there's actually a dip in the pavement. And we know that that's going to break open at some stage. And then, of course, there's all these other assets. So there are drainage systems, which can make a big impact again on how things deteriorate and on user safety. Your lining, bridges, what happens underneath the bridge as well as on top, and all these other assets, the traffic systems, the signage, the lighting. So in actual fact, managing risk, as we know, becomes a very, very complex affair. And the codes of practice and the asset management guidance talk about risks at different levels of the authority. One of the primary ones there is at the strategic level, what understanding is there of highway risk? And this may well differ from organisation to organisation. And actually, you know, members might understand, for example, what the public say, they might understand about potholes. Do they understand really all the nuances of highway risk, the skid resistance or the longer term deterioration? And how does that sit with other corporate risks? We all know that organisations have to balance their risk across all their services, and that's incredibly true of local authorities where there's social care and childcare issues as well. And what level of risk is the organisation prepared to accept? And in fact, there can't be a fully informed decision about that unless the authority has true understanding of what risk there is. And that's really quite important. And again, we've heard from previous speakers about the need for transparency and clarity about what's happening at that level, why the organisation is making the decisions that they're making. And then at the tactical level, which I suspect might be quite a few people here in the room, there's the big balancing act going on about what resources, funding, staff, time, IT are available, and how can you best use those? You know, what types of risks have been identified? How can it be mitigated? And actually, it goes back and forth a bit because you need to know what level of risk your organisation will accept, but they need to have an understanding of what risks we're actually facing. And obviously the very important side of the operational, that's all got to translate into something that happens on the ground. So are the maintenance activities supporting a risk-based approach? Do they also tie in with asset management? And what's the relationship between preventative and reactive maintenance? And the public. Are safety risks different from condition risks? Well, there's obviously a correlation, there's obviously a relationship, but as we could see from the pothole versus the crazing, there can be a very different perception of what might need addressing. Again, how does the safety maintenance regime align with asset management? And finally, what do the public really understand about a risk-based approach? And we've heard about that particular coroner's report, where really I think there was not much understanding either of the current approach by that authority, nor of what the risk-based approach really meant. And I guess part of our job is to help people understand with good evidence and with good explanations. So, risk. It is complex. It's holistic and cross-cutting rather than based on single factors. So you can't just take one piece of information, time or condition. It is affected by local factors. You know, there is that concern that without standards it could be more difficult, but we already know, there are lots of local factors, and some of those could be about political preference or public perception, and some of those could be about what type of weather events you have or what construction your assets are made from. And it requires decisions at all these different levels, and those decisions have to go back and forth. One has to inform the other. So data. So we've heard a lot about data. And I actually took this quote from the world of finance, who, as we all know, ran quite a few risks themselves back in 2010 and had to do a lot of work on their risk management. But I think it sums up what we need to know as well, that capturing the correct data can prove critical to ensuring the right people discuss, monitor and manage risks appropriate for consideration at each level of the organisation. And it goes on to say that data is the core bottom-up enabler for risk management. And well-managed highway infrastructure also has quite a bit to say about data, and I won't go through all these recommendations, I'm sure you're all quite aware, but an awful lot about how we manage, collect and use and look after our data and our information. So obviously data is essential, and there's quite a lot of data that needs to go into deciding your risk-based approach. And, you know, starting at the very beginning, Steve Berry talked about capturing inventory and condition. There's identifying the hierarchy, which will require additional data sets and additional data analysis, undertaking the risk assessments, deciding what takes priority, the long-term planning, and then the operational work on the ground and the review. But one thing you notice as we go through the list, that at the beginning it starts off with data in itself, but as you go through that list it's much more about how we actually use that data, how we apply it and what it actually means. And again, what well-managed highway infrastructure code of practice says is a risk-based approach to highway maintenance needs to be founded on information that is sufficiently robust to enable decisions on levels of service to be taken and reviewed over time. And that's backed up by the World Roads Association. Again, acknowledge that it is a complex task. So really, you start to think about data as information. And the key then is not just good data, but it's how to bridge any disconnect between data and people, whether that's decision makers, whether that's operational, whether it's the public, that data has to be understood at many different levels and probably in many different formats. And if it's going to serve as robust information, it needs to be accurate, and that's to a high degree. So if you're actually doing either investment modelling or you're looking at your risks, it needs to be pretty accurate, because even 5%, once you start extrapolating that, can be a lot out by the time you get where you want to. And reliable, and that's in time as well as spatially, as well as location based. You need to know where, when and with what frequency things are going to happen to your assets. Repeatable for the local context. So in terms of providing valid evidence. If something that you did a year ago bears no correlation to something you're doing this year, then that's going to be quite difficult, and it certainly doesn't make your case for being understood about basing it on risk and all these factors you've looked at very good. And again, the local context. So if you do have well-known flood sites, or you do have other factors, risk factors that are going to affect, or developing risk factors, then that has to be repeatable and built in to your planning. We've heard quite a lot about transparency, and obviously it's a word that's used a lot in the highway industry, but that really needs to, it's really essential for clarity in decision making, and as we've seen, for also evidence in court and for evidence to members about why you're doing what you're doing. And so that means it needs to be easy to understand, analyse and demonstrate. Now, it doesn't mean that the data needs to be simplistic, but it does mean that how you use it and how you present it needs to be understandable to the wider world and ultimately relevant to what happens in the real world. Because again, all the modelling in the world isn't going to make much difference if actually, something's happening on the road and you're either not aware of it, not addressing it, or not addressing the public perception of it. So I've just done some examples really of data acting as robust information. And clearly an accurate and comprehensive inventory and condition data is a very good starting block. And that has to be the indication of the assets as they are in the real world. And the ability to overlay different data sets and correlate information. So we had a query about a bid area, for example, or high levels of footfall. And from that, to be able to carry out and make your own risk assessments, because after all, it is about your own local context. And again, consideration of the whole asset base, which does make it very complicated, because there are different standards for different assets, different things going on, but it does at least allow you to identify where there might be prime consideration required of all those assets. And that leads on to things like the identification of critical infrastructure and the resilient network. And again, the resilient network, the point about this is that it's working across different teams. So that might be emergency planning, or it might be insurance, who won't necessarily know highway assets like you do, and different sectors, because critical infrastructure isn't always owned by the council, and different authorities. And ultimately, that idea of the one land network, which is about also what you do in parks, cemeteries, and other places. So having a really good basis for being able to manage all these different bits of data is very important. And just to give you an example, map-based data has made a big difference, I think, to how people can view things. And obviously, there are systems out there, quite a few systems that will allow you to do this. I've chosen to show Gaist. As you can see, we use 5 grades of condition. One of the reasons for that is because it tells you what that middle bit is doing. So amber can be quite a big category. Is that amber do something almost immediately, or is that amber actually keep a watch on that over the next 3 years? So it's broken down much more. And if we take perhaps just that bit of condition, that polygon there, obviously what's also really important is the record behind it, that data, again, that says to you, actually this road is functionally impaired, it's going to make a difference to users. It's actually this big, this is the area, this is where it is, this is how much the carriageway is actually being affected. The damage types as well, it's identifying the different damage types, and some of those are risk factors. So reinstatement, it might be in quite a good condition for reinstatement, but it's still a risk factor. It's still something that alongside the fretting and subsidence is telling you actually that carriageway is not in great condition. And high definition ability to visually see what's on your network as well, I think is really important alongside that condition data. And again, that's something that Gaist captures with their cameras, but that's the same part of the carriageway, so you can see actually that reinstatement patch isn't doing as well as we might like. And when it comes to risk analysis, then obviously we talked about overlaying different data sets, and thank you to Blackpool for letting me use theirs. But if you wanted to look at, say, where your cycle tracks are on the carriageway, what condition is that carriageway. Cyclists, as we know, and motorcyclists can be actually very high risk users for various reasons. So if you add in junctions as well, what's happening at your junction, whether that's condition, whether that's lining, whether it's the traffic systems, do you have flooding issues there, which could make a difference, particularly to the more vulnerable users. So you can see, you can start to build up a picture of what's really happening on the network, or what really could happen on the network. And I come back to this quite a lot, really, and I'm sure, again, that's something that you all feel quite strongly, is that data really has to work in the real world, the world that you're dealing with all the time. And that means that when you're doing your treatment plans, you need to know that they're as accurate as they can be, because there isn't money to waste. There's not enough money usually to do everything you would like to. And having a system that's actually constantly updated, so it doesn't just sit there and wait for maybe the next time a survey is done, or the next change of anything that goes on at strategic level, but actually you're getting all that other information from other sources, highway inspectors being a primary example, but there can be others. And accessible and meaningful to all staff. We've talked quite a lot about the safety inspection and how do people understand what it is that's required of them, and actually being able to see what asset managers maybe are looking at, or to input into something, makes a big difference, I think, to how staff can see things. Again, prioritisation of schemes using risk-based criteria. I think that's very important, so it's all tying in with the risks that you've identified. And when it comes to safety inspections, all that information should actually make a difference to the safety inspections. So we've heard earlier about if something is actually needing a repair infrequently, have you then built up that evidence? Can you show that? Can you demonstrate why you made the decision you did? Or conversely, actually, if it's a high-risk area, for whatever reasons you decide, should you be either repairing more quickly there or inspecting more frequently? And hopefully, eventually closing any gaps between the way that capital, preventative and reactive is used. And again, here's an example of Knowsley, actually, where there's condition data overlaid with potential schemes. So this is where the funding is for this particular area of road. But as you can see, the actual candidate schemes are chosen using different factors which include risk. So the road layout or the geometry, for example, the amount of profile defects, and also here, the workplace population in the vicinity, so understanding the movement of people. And then the strategic level, I come back to, again, how you demonstrate an understanding of highway risk that runs all through the authority. And it's quite heartening, I think, to hear both Zurich and Steve Berry offering to come and talk to, at strategic level for authorities, because, there are consequences of failure. And, people do talk about transport and highways being the backbone of the economy, but what does that really mean in a local context? That's actually very important and really good to be able to illustrate. And social value, and the photograph here is actually again in Blackpool, who did a lot of work with members on identifying within residential areas where there would be a big impact in terms of social value, whether that's schools or parks or local shopping centres, if those roads and pavements and other infrastructure weren't maintained and looked after. And I think this also helps with proving that you've done training and competency. It doesn't give people a certificate, but again, if you've demonstrated your data as information in ways that people can use and understand and make decisions on, then they are gaining more and more understanding and competency in what a real risk-based approach means. And the highly visual representations, I think, are a very good way of bringing home to people why it is that you've made the decisions, or what it is that goes into that decision making. And of course, that can also help with across boundaries, and that's where how you collect data can also be important, as well as how you use and display data, because it will aid collaborative working, obviously, if people bring together their data and their information. And the ability to display that in different ways and with different scenarios. So you can, what happens if this risk is greater, or what happens if we have a really severe weather event that in our local area would make this difference. And finally, as Steve Berry talked about, we still have to agree investment plans across all highway assets, using all that information that we've got. You know, I've put highway information there, but this is the opportunity to bring in those other data sets as well. And that puts you in a very good position if you know what you've got, you know what it's doing, you know when it's going to do something. Puts you in a good position, I think, for the funding bids, because, you know, a lot of additional funding nowadays comes through that competitive bidding. And so I have paused to look at the longer term investment planning, because obviously the big fear are the courts, the judges, what's happening to the users. But we can't forget that we need to have a long-term view of our highways, and that's what else the data is here for. You know, use as much as you have and use it wisely to look at what are the different options for you as an authority, given your funding levels, given your preferences, given your risk factors. And as you can see, actually, if you only do the worst, you're still saving up a whole heap of trouble there in the red that are going to trip users up in the longer term, and are probably going to be quite costly to repair in the longer term. And again, it's yet to be tried in the courts, perhaps, this whole risk-based approach, but I think that's an important part of showing that the local authority has a very considered approach to how it wisely uses its funds. And of course, if we get stuck in that vicious circle where the capital is only used to support safety defect issues, back in the short-term planning, and everything else deteriorates, becomes much more expensive to fix, and safety defects increase. And of course, I know you all know that, and I know there isn't necessarily enough funding to go around to do everything. And again, that's part, I think, of making the decisions based on risk, what you think is the most important, and showing why you think it is. And maybe the nirvana, the holy grail, would be to get to the point where our modelling takes into account all the risk factors over a long period of time and can build in what you do when to the best of your funding. And certainly in the meantime, I think the important thing is to do the best you can with the information you've got, and make sure that data is actually really being used. And it can be as complex as you like when you collect it, but when you're interpreting it, when you're demonstrating it, when you're showing it, make it into real information, make it into robust information. So just to finish really, well-managed highway infrastructure, it says delivering a safe and well-maintained highways relies on good evidence and sound engineering judgment. So really, the point about data is it's there to support your engineering judgment, it's there to support your risk-based approach. In the right way, it's your evidence, and it should be good evidence. If you make sure you document things, that you make sure you've done those processes, that evidence is the fundamental plank to show why you're doing what you're doing.